Okay, so this is I'll start from the ink. This ink is a mixture of 3 types of ink. It's a Charbonnel ink. It's a mixture of RSR, 55981 and 55985. So they're all different composites of pigmentation in the ink. So I mixed 3 together, in that the RSR is the strongest pigmented ink, and it contains, so when the ink's in the line, the ink doesn't generally bleed, so that's why I use the RSR. So it gives a reasonable body to the ink. So now I've mixed a small amount of ink, and now I'm going to, I keep working it so it's quite pliable and ready to go. So I'm all set up, I've got my squeegee, and I'll just start putting the ink on the plate. Away I go. So I start squeegeeing the ink. The reason I don't use a roller or rub it in with a rag is I find this gets a better coating over the entire surface, and it pushes all the ink very much into the crevices of the plate. So in this case, this plate's a fairly heavily worked plate, and it's a combination of techniques of line etch, soft ground, dry point, engraving, spit bite, sugar lift, and many aquatints. So basically it's the full gamut of pretty much the etching technique, and a lot of roulette in there as well. The hot plate's on and the plate's just lukewarm. I don't like having it too hot or having it too cold with this ink, so if it's in the middle of winter, the heat might be slightly increased on the hot plate, just to facilitate the ink being fairly workable, but not too runny at all. So it's fairly. So the idea is fundamentally to get as much ink on the plate, wipe as much ink as you can off the plate without over wiping the plate, and printing the plate so it records onto paper the maximum amount of nuances that the plate contains, so you don't lose any detail or any finer aquatint surface. So that's now ready to, I'll go through all my little rituals. So that's, with the ink has been pre-mixed, so what I do is I don't just mix it from the tin, like take a bit out of each tin. I actually get the contents of the tin, put it on a slab of glass and other contents of the tin and mix up. So I've mixed up all that ink is now ready to addition. So that's additioning type of ink. If I was proofing, I would just probably maybe just use a bit of one of them without worrying too much. But the additioning ink is actually ready to go. So I've got a consistent amount of ink made up that I know that in the next 4 or 5 etchings that I addition, the ink will be continuous all the way through. So I'm now using tarlatan in various grades of thickness, and I'll start just wiping. This way of doing it also pushes any extra ink back into the fine line work. So whilst you're being fairly careful, you know that this will actually put enough ink all over the surface of the plate. But what I'm attempting to do now is to get an even, fairly even wipe of ink over the surface. And when I first started printing, I didn't print like this at all. So when I first started printing was in early 1966, and I actually was a student of a guy called Udo Sellback. And Udo was a lithographer etcher, and I actually ended up helping him print his etchings for him. So as a student, I loved to help other people print their plates, because for me, I could see that if you didn't know how to print a plate, you were at a very serious disadvantage. So I started helping Udo with his plates, and I learned an enormous amount about additioning from him. He made a couple of interesting series of works, sort of anti-Vietnam War etching plates that he made, and they were exhibited in Melbourne. He then, a few months later, went on and was the foundation member of the Print Council of Australia. So he was a very formative man, and he spent a lot of time working in the South Australian Art School before he came to RMIT. He was as I say, he was a trained lithographer, but he was a terrific etcher as well, and a really good teacher. So initially I figured I was fairly well taught on how to print, but I learnt a lot more as the years went on, so I had a reasonable grounding to start with. The inks in those days were a little different. They were all English inks in those days, and you had to work them up a lot more than the inks that you have now, meaning they were a lot heavier, densely pigmented inks. So now at the moment I'm just trying to get an even, I'm reading it over so now I'm already sort of in a sense mindful of what I'm doing, even though I'm talking and I normally don't do that. And what I'm doing is I'm mindful of the drawing of the plate already, so I'm wiping a little bit heavier in some areas and not in others. So I progressively go through the stages, so this should take off a bit, then I'll do a little bit of paper, and then I'll do a little bit of hand wiping. So this plate, I spent probably 12 months working on this plate, getting frustrated with it, changing it, scraping it away, doing that sort of thing. So I do a fair bit of, I don't do a lot of proofing of the plate, actual printing of it before I'm ready. I'll take it through as best I can without proofing it, and then I'll proof it, and then usually hate it, and then I start working again on it, and then put it away and work for a few more months. But it's looking all right so far. This is about the 6th or 7th of this I've printed, so I'm fairly familiar with it now. I usually edition the work I make, and I've been doing that since the mid-80s. Sometimes the editions are a little bit smaller, sometimes a little bit larger, but normally they're around 25, 30. Okay, so that's looking not too bad. I learnt a lot initially, as I said, from Udo. The Germans print differently than the French, and the Spanish print differently from them, and the Dutch print differently. So every country's got its own little variation, which I learnt a lot about in France. But I worked with some pretty interesting printers, so I've picked up a lot of little technical things from them over the years, and a variety of printers. So some were good aquatint printers, some were good engraving printers, some were good dry point printers, and some were good colour printers. So working with a variety of these guys, I picked up many different techniques. So I'll just do a little bit of paper. Now what I'm doing with the paper is just taking off just another small amount, and then I'll hand wipe a bit, and then I'll probably should be alright after that. So at the moment I'm just concentrating on the light areas and the mid-grey areas. But again, mindful that I don't overwipe too much. So what I'm doing is I'm just taking off very fine film now. I know where the lights are in the plate, the whites and the mid-grey, so I'm just... I used to be quite tentative when I first started printing and not really aware that you can be quite firm, but you have to be fairly quick when you're doing it. So I've got that down now to a certain level. It's looking okay. Now some people could print that now, but it's not quite right. And you're sort of reading it as you're going there. Okay. Now this part, get the egg going. I'm not actually putting whiting on the plate, I'm just using it to get the sort of film on my hand. And now I'll just very gently hit the surface and just take off that very fine film that you can't take off in any other way. Paper's too coarse. So I'm wiping out from the centre on this one. Now I know there's a bit of light around the shoulders and so on of the man, so I'll spend a fraction of time there. It's very interesting watching different people print when they hand wipe. The guys in Paris, when they hand wiping, were fantastic. One guy had this hand like a piece of steak, and he was their top Aquatine printer, which only problem was that he was alcoholic. And when I worked with him, it was just great because he loved printing these plates because there's so much Aquatine on these surfaces that for him it was an absolute joy, and I think he stopped drinking for half an hour wiping a plate, so that was great. Okay, that's not too bad. Okay, right. Just do a bit there. Okay. Now, this is another technique. I didn't know about this technique till I worked with a guy called Luke, and Luke's probably the best printer in the world, really. And he, I used to have lunch with him pretty regular, and he printed a lot of my editions from 3 years that I spent in France. So I learned a lot from him, and I never printed any of my plates there, but I was with him every time he made a print, so I watched him and helped him. Here we go, right. This is called another little technique. It's just called retouchage. This is what it's called, and it's a sort of, what you're doing is you're just bringing up the ink from the surface of the plate again, just fractionally out of the line, just slightly softening it. Otherwise it has a sort of feel like it's a slightly softer wipe. Normally I do this. Sometimes I don't do this, but most of the time I do, particularly with Aquatine. Okay, and you're just touching the surface, okay? It's done. Now I'll just go around the edge and clean it up. I usually put paper down because then I clean up paper every time I print, and so the back of the plate doesn't get ink on it, and also no lumps of ink get under the plate, so that destroys the surface when it passes through the press. So okay, so this gets put over here, and then I'll just take off any excess moisture, let it sit for a minute, printing on, so the Somerset's here and the Somerset's there so you can read it. This surface is just a little bit different than the other side. So now I just carefully go over it and just bring up the lint of the paper a whisker. This is particularly good for aqua tints. Now sometimes you can really scrub it and bring up the lint everywhere, but this paper doesn't really need it, so that's probably enough. That's ready. I wouldn't, in this winter, it's all right, but you've just got to not be too slow in doing it, because you want the plate, if possible, to be slightly warm. So printing again in Paris, it was always this temperature in the room because their heaters were on. I'll change nippers. I'll change the nippers over so they're better. Now I've got to swing around this way. So this is now positioned on the plate, the registration plate. It's ready. Slides in. That goes over. Get the pillowcase out. Pressure's right. Come around here and I'll throw these back. And I'll do it that way for you again. Might be upside down, I don't know. Yes, it will be. Okay, there it is. Look all right? Should look all right. Better. Okay, I'll throw it over here, and this is number 9. So I'll just put my little 9 on the bottom so I know when I'm registering it, when I finally sign it and document it, I know that this is the 9th print I've made in the edition. So I can keep a good record of it. And I'll have a look at it, maybe have a look at it next to the next one. Doesn't look too bad. Yeah, there's always going to be slight variations, but it's fine. Okay, that'll just sit there. Now I'll pop him up in his little house for a while. He goes away for the time being to dry, and then when that's dry, in a few days, I'll stack them and then re-dampen them, and then I'll flatten them properly. That's how I do it. Okay.